Hey there, everybody. I'm John Tuttle. What If Studios is a video production network, and I thought we'd try our hand at audio productions too, just because there are some things which can be presented through audio better than they can through video. As said in the description, we'll be posting both nonfiction as well as fiction, and we will let you know in advance which of those two it's going to be. This pilot episode is a non-fictional piece, which presents the audio recording at the 41st Annual Convention of the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars at Benedictine College. The title of this year's convention was The Future of Science, Technology, and the Human Person. I went to the talks on artificial intelligence, and the following audio was taken from the three scholars in relevant fields who spoke at the ceremony. The morals behind some of the implications of this tech are also explored. Enjoy.
Now, I'll introduce all three of our speakers for the panel, and then we'll let each one present, and then we'll have question and answers for the panel at the end. First, we hear from Dr. Charles Sprouse, who is not only faculty but also alumnus of Benedictine College, having completed a bachelor's degree in physics. Then he went on to the University of Kansas for a doctorate in mechanical engineering and has worked in industrial consulting, focusing on automotive and transportation research. Apparently designs those little things, those display screens in your car, so that they don't distract you. Also modeling diesel particulate filters and, get this, organic Rankine cycles. And you can ask for that one in the Q&A. Secondly, we'll hear from Dr. Nicholas Eberstadt, the Henry Wentz Chair in Political Philosophy at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington. He researches and writes on demographics, economic development, poverty, and social well-being. And he, with the previous speaker, his wife Mary Eberstadt, will receive the Cardinal White Award this evening's banquet. Finally, a representative from the humanities on this panel, theologian Jordan Wales from Hillsdale College. He took a BS in engineering from Swarthmore, then a Master of Science in Cognitive Science and Natural Language from the University of Edinburgh, and finally a PhD in theology from Notre Dame. First then, we'll have Dr. Sprouse, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Gretchen. And thank all of you for being here. Yesterday, the panel was down in Westerman Hall, and so I recognize that you guys have come here from near and far. And since the panel number one was about 20 steps from my office, I feel like coming to this panel number 3 puts me in some type of union with you. Having to travel so far, 7 floors up, 100 steps, and so on. But I'm blessed to be here, and I'm grateful for the invitation and to be with all of you. I'll be talking mostly about transportation. So artificial intelligence is a general category of computer program, and I figured not many of you are familiar with it, so I thought I would just give one of the simplest examples that a lot of you can associate with. That being classification of photos. So from what I hear, I've never actually been on Facebook, but people tell me that it pops up when somebody loads a photo of you and it says, hey, you're in this picture over here that somebody loaded. So the way these programs work is you have an input, which is your first layer, and then you have hidden layers, which include nodes and connections of various lengths, whatever length you determine. And then you have an output. And the process by which these are trained is that you would run a whole bunch of photos through the program, with the program not really being structured in the beginning other than you defining the number of layers. And through its mistakes, the program corrects the connections and the node strength weights in order to finally come to a well-performing, trained program wherein you can put in a picture of a cat, which is a really popular topic on the internet, and it will recognize correctly that that is in fact a cat. Whereas if you look in the training data set towards the beginning, it thought the dog near the top was actually a cat, but through the refinement process, it now can correctly recognize only a cat. In fact, better than a human in many cases. So what are the topics that I'm going to be talking about on transportation? That was just because I wasn't sure how familiar you were with artificial intelligence programs. The three things I'm going to talk about first would be common applications. So there are tons of applications, and this is a huge field. I decided to talk about transportation because last year, or I guess earlier this year at the 2018 AI conference, EcoMotion, which is a nonprofit, recognized 580 new startup companies in the area of smart transportation. So this is a huge field, and I'm just going to hit the main applications. Secondly, since autonomous vehicles are of primary importance, it's the most discussed in the news, and in many ways it poses the most opportunities and challenges. I'm going to focus specifically on that. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about how myself, one Catholic engineer, thinks about these types of problems. Vehicles on demand. So you've seen, like with Uber type companies, you can now use your phone and call to try to get a ride from somebody. Well, when you have self-driving cars with artificial intelligence, what you're able to do is, in fact, call a car or share a car with a group of people. So no longer would my car only be driven 5% of the time, but in fact, I might own one personal car for my wife to drive my kids around reliably in case one of them hurts themselves. And then maybe if I only need a car sometimes, then I could end up sharing that car with about 20 people. So it would end up with fewer cars, and it would be economically beneficial for me to own, let's say, 1/20th of a car as opposed to an entire car that's rarely used. Going along with this very closely is something called self-healing, which is the cars would need to keep track of when they need to be maintained, and so there would be sort of an increase in sensors or data collection as to how the vehicle itself is performing. And then when it needed maintenance, tire rotation, oil change, if it still has an engine, then it would drive itself into the shop, presumably the highest rated shop that artificial intelligence could find in the area, get fixed, and then go back to whatever else it needs to be doing. We're going to talk a lot about self-driving cars, but it turns out that an IBM study in 2015 said that self-healing cars, or cars that knew when they needed to be maintained, was actually the most requested, or the thing that global population was most interested in out of their vehicles, above self-driving. Another application would be fleet management. So when you have large numbers of fleets, let's say your UPS, that would be an easy example, or your Amazon. Amazon has tractor trailers, they also have UPS type trucks, they also have vans, and they also have drones delivering packages. So for us, it's computationally difficult to even recognize all the connections that are present that are needed to determine what would be the optimal fleet for Amazon. So how many drones do I need? How many UPS type trucks do I need? And so on. And so the benefits would be you end up having fuel savings by having the right number of vehicles, or if you're planning flights, Like this map on the right is Amazon Air, is an Amazon Air delivery map from a couple years ago. If you're planning those types of flights, artificial intelligence is incredibly important for that. And in fact, one of our engineering graduates from a couple years ago has gone straight into this field. Application number 3 would be car driver communication. So something that hasn't traditionally been accomplished with cars, but has been recognized by engineers, is that drivers tend to be one of the least reliable parts of the car. And so what we can do is we can actually sense whether the driver is paying attention, number one. We could also sense whether they were sleepy or whether they were in fact completely asleep. And since artificial intelligence provides your playlists for Pandora and so on, it could in fact wake you up with some type of song that you really despise if you fall asleep while you're driving. If my wife's car knows that I'm getting in on Sunday morning to drive us to Mass, it could adjust where the seat is, and it could adjust all the mirrors, and it could adjust all kinds of things for me. All right, application number 4, autonomous vehicles. So some of the main benefits you'll hear people talk about with autonomous vehicles as what's motivating the research would be, with the average person commuting, according to the DOT, 25.4 minutes to work, so over 50-minute commute time per day. If we could have the cars drive us, then obviously that would free us up to do whatever we would like to do, which could be, in general, it's a good thing. Whether it's abused, that's a different story. But, we could, in theory, fulfill ourselves by praying. It's not quite 30 minutes, but it's pretty close. You could get a pretty good prayer in on the way to work, right? Increased safety. So it has been the case that automated vehicles have traditionally been much more dangerous than human drivers. Human drivers, while I said they were unreliable, can actually drive about 165,000 miles per accident, which is pretty good, right? So, we've been dominating computers. That is until 2012, when Google went 300,000 miles without an accident, and then they just stopped because that was the end of the test. So, in fact, even though we're pretty decent drivers, it's incredibly likely, virtually certain, that autonomous vehicles are going to be safer drivers than we are. And even more so if we can get them to communicate with each other. So I hear in the big cities, the statistics are it could be 30%. Is that right? About 30% of driving time for some people is trying to find a parking spot. So if you're from a big city, or maybe you know somebody there, this is an application that people have been savoring over in the big cities for a while. Moving from applications to talk about how these autonomous vehicles actually function, because it's good to know in general what our applications are and what the benefits are, but we need to know kind of where we're at in the development of this technology, and I just want to give you some basics of how the technology works. So the Society of Automotive Engineers has essentially 5 levels of autonomy. So as the technology develops, we start with number 0, which is what we engineers always like to start with. And that's just like my car. Everything's up to me. It doesn't really do anything to help me. Then we go on to a driver assistance type system with number 1, wherein we're basically just getting warnings from the car. So Volvo in 2007 was the first to roll out this blind spot detection system. So if somebody's coming up quickly on one side of you and you're about to move into the next lane, then the car would not take over driving, but it would warn you and say, if you don't straighten up your wheel, you're going to crash into somebody that's in your blind spot. Then we have partial automation and conditional automation, which are things like the car actually taking over in certain situations. So if you're going to crash, if you're going too quickly and there's a car parked in front of you, and you don't seem to be pressing the decelerator or the brake pedal, then the car is going to actually brake for you. And it turns out almost half of accidents in the US, so we have a lot of people dying, almost half of those incidents would be stopped just with that, or are stopped just with that automatic braking system. And then we have high automation. Well, another thing on conditional automation, that would be like if you've heard of the company called Tesla is the one that's always in the news. They have a technology called autopilot, and that's a technology where you can let the car drive, but you're supposed to be paying attention, and it will tell you if it comes up to construction or it sees something that it's not sure about. So you have to pay attention the whole time, but the car will be able to handle certain circumstances partially. In number 4, the car will be able to handle certain circumstances entirely. So on the all-important topic of beer delivery, in 2007, a company called Otto went 130 miles of highway driving without any accident, with the semi-tractor trailer having complete control while it was driving. So that would be the case of high automation. We can't turn that semi loose in the city, but we can actually turn it loose on the highway, and it's safe. Number 5 is the ultimate goal, wherein you could imagine the steering wheel being optional. So if driving happens to be a fulfilling activity for you, which to me it would be sometimes at least, then you could have a steering wheel. But if you're not interested in that, then we could sell you a car without one. Other information, we have to know where we are. So we have a big antenna for GPS, and then we have smaller sensors that can reinforce what we're getting from the LiDAR sensor. So in engineering, you'll sometimes have a redundant system where you can measure something. I think there's a car there, let me measure it a different way, and that would be confirmation or increase my confidence that there's a car there. And the function of the colored camera is because, at least with our level of connectivity now, the car still needs to be able to see when the light turns green so that it can go. All right, so Chris Urmson is a guy that was leading the autonomous vehicle project at Google during the time that I mentioned that 300,000-mile trip. He since left, and he started his own company. And so this is kind of his explanation of how these vehicles work. What you're going to see is at the very beginning, it starts with this map, knowing where the intersections are and where the lanes are. And what you see is the car uses artificial intelligence to locate all of the vehicles around it, which would be the purple boxes. So that's using artificial intelligence to do that classification. A LiDAR is hitting something, but what is it hitting? Then we also have to be able to see, like in the distance, you can see construction cones. So that's sort of an advanced thing that you need to know, where the construction cones are and what all the other cars are doing. So once all the cars are located, all of these paths come up, which are their predictions of where the cars are going to be moving. And Chris is saying, once there's the determination of what everybody else is doing, only then do you decide the actual path that you want to go, and it becomes a simple problem of, do I go straight, turn left, turn right? Do I go the same speed, or do I decelerate or accelerate? But as you can see, it's a very geometric problem, which is complicated in the city. Remember how we talked about that self-driving tractor trailer is not ready for the city yet? This is why. We have all of these pedestrians which are harder to predict, and we also have special categories that we have to deal with. So you'll see a cyclist. If you look in this video on the bottom left, there's a cyclist on the right side. Cyclists do special things that other vehicles don't do, like they stick their hand out, which means they're going to be turning to the left. And those are more complicated things that the system has to be able to recognize, maybe not on the highway, but if you want a fully autonomous vehicle that can get around in the city safely, you're going to have to be able to recognize the arms of cyclists. You're going to have to be able to recognize the stop sign that comes out on the side of a bus. You're going to have to be able to recognize the lights that are on top of a police vehicle, and so on. Of course, the engineers are the ones developing the technology, so we need the engineers to adhere to the engineer's code of ethics, which would be, in my case, American Society of Mechanical Engineers, make it very apparent that using our knowledge and skill for the enhancement of human welfare is an important principle for an engineer. Similarly, there's a canon that states that engineers must hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public in the performance of their duties. So, with all of these opportunities, we do still have challenges. There are ethical challenges, and there are psychological challenges. So there was a paper that was put out in 2017 with a really rigorous study of how people respond more strongly to a crash or a death that's caused by something that's automated. It doesn't even have to be a vehicle, but if it's a robotic machine in an assembly plant, if the robots in the assembly plant kill the same number of people that other people do in accidents, people are still more fearful of the robots. Also, how are the decisions being made? So that's just a call for transparency, and there's a good case to represent that on the next page. But for the heartwarming story, since I just mentioned people dying in a manufacturing facility, this is one opportunity that's pretty cool with self-driving cars. If you have, in this case, a blind man who was the first person that Google allowed to drive or to, ride and take ownership of one of their self-driving cars. So for a blind person, adding some mobility and some freedom to them is a non-trivial thing, as well as the elderly or those that have other health issues that prevent them from being capable drivers. They can rely, of course, on their friends and family as much as they would like to, but they could also have their independence of being able to call in a self-driving car. All right, another thing that happens, so the ethical dilemma, the so-called trolley question, traditional trolley question where you had some person who's conducting it, and the trolley is going to run over some people, or the switch can be flipped, and instead of running over 5 people, we can actively make the decision to kill this person over here. The traditional philosophical question or an ethical dilemma, that used to be a driver or an operator, but now it's become the programmer of artificial intelligence programs who has to make that decision, right? So the case of the lower right picture would be an example of that. I have a vehicle that's going straight. If it continues going straight, maybe it's going to hit a couple people. And the car would probably be smart enough to estimate the amount of damage that would be done to those people. Or we could sharply turn to the left and crash into this barricade, which would certainly not be good for the driver of the vehicle, and maybe if it may be fatal to the driver of the vehicle, right? So what happens is the engineer has to make this decision. And it's well known that in artificial intelligence, self-driving cars, this is something that's going to have to be addressed. However, as shown by this quote up here, by the Senior Director of Automotive at NVIDIA, let me preface this talk by saying, you're not allowed to ask the grandma versus the baby carriage question. In other words, engineers are trying to get around this, but we as the public need this to be transparent. What type of program is it going to be? Because it has ethical consequences, and also we need to be able to be honest when we're selling the vehicles to people, right? So people are scared of the car that will continue to go straight and run over them, right? People don't want to buy the car that's going to turn to the left and crash right into the barricade, right? And it becomes more and more complex. In fact, I was talking with a good friend of mine the other day, and it turned out that if the car was able to sense someone's age, for example, a salesman might end up having to say, while you're young, this car is going to run over the other person, but eventually it's going to crash into the barricade. Right? So there was a big study at Oxford. They came out with a 100-page report. The report is called The Malicious Use of Artificial Intelligence Forecasting, Prevention, and Mitigation. And they made some recommendations. One of the recommendations that I really took to heart was that us as engineers in AI, we need to steal the best practices from other disciplines, a very liberal arts type of concept, right? So as far as security, we need to protect our vehicles because the first case in 2016, someone used a cell phone to hack a Tesla car and they stole the car, right? So you could have your car be opened by somebody's cell phone that hacked your car. And of course, more malicious things could be done with these types of vehicles via remote control, especially if they're not just vehicles, but they're semis or drones or full-size aircraft. Connectivity, so we already talked about how the safety would be improved with connectivity between the vehicles. And as a mechanical engineer, we talk about robots and runaway artificial intelligence. The best practice would be to have something like this, known as an emergency stop button. So if it starts doing something you don't like, this happens to also be a Wi-Fi emergency stop button. So if you can't catch the robot, you can turn it off with your phone. Something I'm particularly concerned in as well is privacy. So if you have all of these vehicles that are making sure you're awake, that know what kind of songs that you like, they might even know your accident history. So maybe I'm going to be okay following closely to Jordan because he's a pretty good driver if I'm the artificial intelligence. But one of you out there might have a history of poor driving, and my car is going to really stay away from you. For certain types of data, let's say biometric data, we could have legislation that would say that the users would have to explicitly agree to this narrow data collection and sharing for the sake of optimizing the programs, and the users would need to be informed about what levels of security are put on their data as protections. On the topic of legislation, so not only are we behind on privacy, but we're behind on self-driving vehicles. National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration issued a voluntary regulation that autonomous vehicle makers are supposed to turn in their safety data and their driving data. And at last check, 2 out of 35 certified autonomous vehicle companies have done that. in part because it's voluntary, right? And we have state-by-state legislations, which are just patches of legislations that were targeted towards regular vehicle driving. I'd like to end on a couple quotes. St. John Paul II, this is what can direct us as Catholic engineers. We're called to use science and technology in a full and constructive way, while recognizing that the findings of science always have to be evaluated in the light of the centrality of the human person, of the common good, and of the inner purpose of creation. Also, in a characteristic way for St. John Paul II, do not be afraid of new technologies. These rank among the most marvelous things which God has placed at our disposal to discover. Thank you, and God bless.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have to begin with a confession. I don't do machine learning. I don't do AI. I have, however, looked at the history of disruptive technologies and their influence on the labor force. AI may turn out to be the big enchilada, but we do have some history and experience with disruptive technologies in the past. And we have suffered tremendous disruption in our labor force in the post-war era, especially with patterns of work for men. So what I'm going to do over my allotted time is give you a little bit of background on what's happened already, on what may have been the role of automation, mechanization, and other disruptors in what I really think is truly a crisis of work for men in America today, and then speculate about what we may face on the eve of a big disruptive leap. So if you look at what's happened in the US economy since the beginning of the 21st century, there are two completely divergent trends. If you look just at wealth creation, we've had a fantastic success in the US economy. We've added $60 trillion, that's with a T, not a B, $60 trillion of private wealth to the US economy. That would be the equivalent of 2 current Chinas, the US wealth holdings. There's nothing like this anywhere in the world. And obviously, if this was all that there was to the story, we could start happy hour now. But there is more, this is what's happened to work rates, to employment to population ratios since the beginning of the century. It's a little bit like that old late night ad, help, I've fallen down and I can't get up. That miserable little thing at the bottom that's trying to claw up a little bit is our unprecedented 10-year economic expansion. And you can see that we're nowhere near back to year 2000 work rates, even after 10 years of expansion and recovery. If we had the same work rates today that we had in the year 2000, there would be 9 million more paid jobs in the United States today. So just think how different our country would be. Now, the story for women in the years in this century has not been entirely happy as far as work and workplace goes. Work rates have gone down for working age women. We've canceled about 3 decades of employment progress with what's happened in recent years. But the really terrible story is what's happened with guys. And in particular, I'm going to focus on what's called prime working age men, 25 to 54. not my definition, Bureau of Labor Statistics definition. Prime working ages are what they sound like. It's the overwhelming majority of people in the workforce. But it's not just an economic matter, because obviously the 25 to 54 age group is when people form families and raise children and all of the rest of continuing society. What this graphic shows from the very beginning of our US monthly jobs reports in 1948 to the present is the percentage of civilian, non-institutional men, 25 to 54 years of age, who have no paid work. And you can see that there really isn't any trend from about 48 to the mid-60s. But for the last 50 years, there's been an eerie and as yet unstopping kind of ratcheting up. See that? It kind of goes up a little higher as a ratchet. And in our decade, in the 2010s, the average monthly percentage of guys with no paid work has been 1 in 6. If you want to know what that is like in historical perspective, I happen to be able to tell you. What I've got up here is some comparisons to the Great Depression. I took last month's job report and the percentage of guys with paid work in the 25 to 54 group, also the 20 to 64 group if you prefer that. Any way you slice or dice it, last month's work rate for guys in America was lower than the rate reported in the 1940 census. And the way the census is done, they ask you about what was happening the previous year, in the previous year. So our jobs report for last month shows that work rates are lower now than they were for American men in 1939. Now, with each one of these things, I have notes and sources on them. You can replicate these if you really want to. But the reason I put those on is so that you don't think that this is fake news. When I say that we have a Great Depression scale problem of work for guys in America, I'm not making this stuff up. And you have to recall that around 1940, the national unemployment rate was over 14%. So this is an extraordinary dislocation. In our era, we have a new option, and that is to be not in labor force, NILF, not labor force, neither working nor looking for work, to be exited from the labor force altogether. And if you take a look at what has happened since the beginning of the post-war era, you have had this geometric increase in that jaggedy blue line there. That's the percentage of prime-age guys neither working nor looking for work. And you've had this kind of irregular, slightly business-cycly gyration of the orange line, which is the head count for people who are guys who are classically unemployed, neither working, not working, but looking for work. And you'll see that now, these two lines haven't intersected for almost 35 years, right? And today, for every guy who is unemployed and looking for work, there are over 3 who are neither working nor looking for work. So if you just look at the unemployment rate, right, you're missing 3/4 of the problem. You're fighting the last war. You're going down the wrong rabbit hole. We need to look at what's happening not only to unemployment, but also to what we might call worklessness for guys. So, I think it is fair to say that the received wisdom among labor economists, and not a labor economist, and policy wonks, and probably not one of those either, the wisdom in those circles is that most of what I've just described to you is due to what would be called demand-side problems, to automation, to mechanization, outsourcing, globalization, consequences of trade, all of which lead to a decline in demand for labor in general and for less skilled labor in particular. Okay. So there is certainly truth in that assessment. And there is probably more than a bit of truth in that assessment. But I don't think that's the whole story. And I'm not even sure that it's most of the story. And I'm going to show you why. This is Exhibit A for the defense. This shows the percentage of guys, prime working age, from like 1965 to the present, who are without paid work. And it's not quite a straight line up. Its R squared is only 0.97. A straight line would be 1.00. But it's what you might call a social science straight line, because human beings. So here's the problem. If you believe that we're dealing with a demand side problem, you should be able to show demand shocks, right? You should be able to show big shocks like with the Great Recession, or with whatever there were, 6 recessions before that, between then and 65. Or you should be able to show a big shock when China entered the World Trade Organization, or when we entered NAFTA, or when we came up with all of these beautiful, disruptive technological innovations. Can't see it. It's almost a straight line. So that's a problem if you think that you've basically been dealing with the demand side shock. Here's a second problem. Let's call it Exhibit B for the defense. What I showed there are workforce participation rates for guys who are high school dropouts. Both of these lines are for high school dropouts. One group is for married high school dropouts. The other is for never married high school dropouts. Can you guess which is which? It's not a traditional difference. What are we talking about? Percentage points participation rate difference? It's a fairly big gap. So if we have a demand side problem, and these are both groups of high school dropouts, would you think maybe this would be a little bit more homogeneous? Why do you have such heterogeneity in the pool of less skilled men? This is another way of showing that. These are, again, all men who are less than high school degree. The top line is married immigrant, foreign-born men. The next line is married native-born men. And the line at the bottom there is never married native-born men. There's a 40-point difference between one of these high school dropout groups and the other. And I haven't actually done the work into this, but I'm pretty sure that if you want to try to explain this in terms of skills or something, K through 10 education in El Salvador isn't that super better than in the United States. I don't think we can explain this in terms of schools. One last thing. Okay. I did a dinosaur, and I studied economics only slightly after the end of the summer. But back in those days, they told us that when there was a shock to a market economy or to a market system, there would be a market-seeking equilibrium effect afterwards, market-seeking equilibrium, right? What we have seen on a state-by-state basis is a gradual widening of the gaps in workforce participation for guys over a 40-year period. And not only has there been a gradual nationwide increase, but in any given year, there are huge differences between states that are adjacent to each other, that border each other. So West Virginia is always perennially troubled. It's always kind of like leader of the pack here. But West Virginia shares a land border with Maryland and Virginia. If you see up near the front, you can see that Maryland and Virginia are all the way on the other side of the chart. Where are the U-balls? Likewise, Maine only shares one land border in the U.S. with another state, and that state is New Hampshire. Maine is way over here, New Hampshire is way over there. If we were dealing with a dominant demand side problem, none of these things that I've shown you would be happening. What about supply side problems? Well, one of the things I would think of in imagining where some supply side problems would come might be with social welfare programs, which might inhibit people's willingness to enter into the labor market. One of the things that we have seen over these same decades has been an explosion of reliance upon disability programs. And we have an archipelago of disability programs in the United States. We have SSI, SSDI, we have veterans benefits, we have workman's comp, we've got state level benefits and all these. And the embarrassing truth, a very Washington truth, is that most of those programs don't talk to each other. So there is no central office in Washington which knows how many people in America, much less how many working prime working age guys, are obtaining disability benefits. The closest I could get was from a Census Bureau survey, surveyed income and program participation, which looks at 4 or 5 of these different programs. If you collate that, you see that almost 3 in 5 prime age guys not in the workforce in 2013, we're always looking in the rearview mirror, in 2013, reported getting 1 or more disability program benefit. And since this is self-reported, it's most likely higher than that. You know, people self-report down like everything except their W-2s. A lot higher than it was the generation before. So basically, most guys who are out of the workforce at this point in these critical age groups are in disability programs. I should say one more thing about this. I didn't put a slide on this. One of the things which one qualifies for after a number of months in eligibility in a disability enrollment in a disability program is eligibility for either our national low-income healthcare program, Medicaid, or if you've been in the labor force enough already, for Medicare. And the overwhelming majority of guys at the lower skill levels are in these 2 programs, if they are also enrolled in disability programs. I think this is quite tragic for the following reason. We all know about the opioid explosion over the last few decades. We all know that 60,000 people at least are dying of opioid poisonings nowadays, more than homicide, more than pre-AI vehicular crashes. Until very, very recently, if one were enrolled in Medicare or Medicaid, you could go to a pain pill factory, and if you got the right doctor, you could get a pain pill script for 90 OxyContin per month. That's a lot of dough. And you would pay $3 out of pocket. You know who would pay the rest, right? You. Eventually, it would be you through Medicaid and Medicare. So inadvertently, our disability programs became co-enablers of this catastrophic explosion. And it is a most gruesome sort of unintended consequence of trying to help people. Work not by me, by Alan Kruger of Princeton, President Obama's chief of Council of Economic Advisors at one time, has shown that about half of the guys who are not in the labor force take pain pills every day. And that's a human tragedy, but this is also what we might call a supply side problem if you're looking at that. That's those are analytical terms. So finally, one more thing. This is the institutional barrier. What sort of institutional barriers do we face now? I was trying to do a book on the men without work problem, and I wanted to get the work rates for guys with felonies. I very quickly found there were no data on this at all because Uncle Sam in his wisdom just forgot to collect information about a felon population, But there are dutiful and dogged demographers who tried to reconstruct this. And this is an article that was published in Demography last year. Their reconstruction, it looks pretty good to me. So as of 2010, there were almost 20 million men and women, adult men and women in the United States, who have felony in their background. Okay? Obviously, overwhelmingly guys. It would be more today, rough back of the envelope calculations, about 24 million. Now, you guys have heard of the mass incarceration problem, right? And you know that there are like 2.5 million people behind bars in the United States, and that's real weird compared to other countries and so forth and so on. Subtract 2.5 million from 24 million, and you have a non-incarcerated population with felony records of over 20 million in the United States. Overwhelmingly men. By my rough calculations, 1 out of every 8 adult civilian non-institutional men in our country today has a felony in his background. And if we were looking at the 25 to 54 people, I bet you it would be higher than that. That is an invisible, enormous institutional barrier problem that is almost never discussed. Okay, so, what I've tried to show you is that in addition to demand side problems accounting for this crisis that I think we have today, there are other factors that do not have to do with technological disruption. There are 900,000 unfilled openings for accommodation and food services. I mean, some of those are high-end, but most of them are not high-skilled. There's 750,000 retail trade. Ditto, not all skill-intensive. There are 250,000 openings for construction. They take physical strength, but a lot, and stamina, but most of those do not take high skill levels. So what we're seeing right now in the United States is not, I think, predominantly a demand-side dislocation problem. We may indeed face more of this at the dawn of the AI era if we have a big disruptive technological leap, but most right now and a great deal in the future will not, I think, have to do with AI. We've got plenty enough problems already to deal with. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I've never used my laptop before. It's supposed to. It's very high tech. I mean, I've used it. I've just never read a paper from it. So it's that trepidation that you just for the first time. Turn on. See how it goes. No, that didn't work. So okay. Forgive me if I pause it. All right. There we go. All right. So. I'm going to pick up and talk about less the functional and more what will initially be the luxury side of artificial intelligence in its penetration into our culture, and that would be specifically in the form of humanoid robots. Over 10 years ago, I left graduate study in artificial intelligence for theology because the questions that I really wanted to ask could not be answered within the computer scientific domain. Even so, I've never lost interest in AI, and although I am now somewhat more modest than once I was in my expertise expectations for its ability to illuminate the human person, I think it's still an important consideration. We live in an interesting time. Now that computers are finally fast enough, artificial neural networks and reinforcement learning have claimed their position as the most promising and powerful form of artificial intelligence yet developed. I think it's therefore important to consider artificial intelligence, which is increasingly and impressively a part of our daily lives, and which, as I said earlier, I do believe will eventually yield robotic agents that in professional interactions, casual conversations, and even shallow romantic relationships will be indistinguishable from human beings. Now, of this eventuality, we must ask two questions. What is it that we will have made? And more importantly, through these artificial entities, what will we make ourselves become? So first, what will we have made? Out of the plethora of questions that one might consider regarding a robot that walks and talks, I would like to ask, how would it work, and what would it be? The former is easy, and the latter is a little more difficult to answer, but perhaps not so difficult as we might think. So first, how would it work? My colleague, Dr. Spruce, has already explained much of the workings of neural networks. But I would like to point out that an artificial neural network does not have the goal of human-like thinking. That is, artificial neural networks do not approximate the rationality of logical rules and relationships. Rather, the goal of an artificial network, neural network, is neuron-like data processing. As Dr. Spruce explained, the neural network has a number of input nodes that have varying strengths of connection to layers upon layers of these nodes. If you put a pattern in at the beginning, it is transformed as its elements are recombined and multiplied and processed until something else comes out at the other end. You can think of an artificial neural network in its training as something like tuning the strings of a piano. The interconnections are adjusted and weighted until the desired behavior or pattern emerges. By this tuning, artificial neural networks can begin to resonate with the entangled and nonlinear relations that are implicit in our world, including relations that cannot easily be discerned or logically represented by human investigators. In other words, the network is receptive to, it is imprinted by the structure of the world. You could almost say that it develops a point of view, although there is no conscious experience here. But there is something like the classical notion of the mind's adequation to a thing. But here that adequation is always constrained by the task for which the AI is trained. So neural networks are the AI that underlies self-driving cars, programs that beat world champions in the games of Go and chess, the ever-useful Google Translate, and of course the tempting recommendations in Pandora and your Netflix feed. Eventually, I do think that we will have walking, talking androids controlled by incredibly powerful neural networks. But what will they be? They will not be persons. In the first place, I do not believe that they will have any conscious experience of the world or of themselves. They will not be subjects with a point of view, as charming as we might find C-3PO and Data from Star Trek The Next Generation. They simply won't be persons. It is not just that they won't have immaterial souls. I don't believe that gorillas have immaterial souls, but whatever Descartes may say, I see no reason to doubt that gorillas do have a conscious experience. Yet artificial neural networks will not have a conscious experience because they are in the end simulations of physical, biological entities. There are no physical connections in an artificial neural network. It is a mathematical construct. I could run a neural network with just as much reality as a computer could if I used a pencil in a notebook, agonizingly slow as it would be. But these calculations would not be any more conscious than a student's physics homework would have gravity. This brings me to the second reason that I do not believe the robot would be a person. Although it could behave in many ways like us, behavior is not the totality of personhood. This was in fact recognized by Alan Turing, the originator of the famed Turing test for artificial intelligence. The Turing test sets a goal, a computer program that can converse such that we cannot tell the difference between that computer and a human. But when we treat this goal, the inseparability or indistinguishability of these conversants, when we treat this goal as a definition of intelligence, then we have slipped into a behaviorist account of the human person, defining the mind not as an inner life, but only as a tendency to exhibit certain observable behaviors under certain conditions. This doesn't just reduce personhood to a capacity for intelligible conversation. This reduces personhood to the tendency to produce the sort of conversation that I am expected to have. This positivistic behaviorism is alive and well in some contemporary philosophy of mind. So the philosopher Daniel Dennett proposes that I will attend to attribute subjectivity and intentionality to a thing when the only way in which I can reliably predict that thing's behavior is to attribute to it the intentionality that I attribute to myself. And this is why I cannot help but ascribe intentionality to human beings, and this is why children cannot help but ascribe intentionality to well-controlled puppets in a puppet show. But Dennett wants to go further than this. He wants to say that when we attribute intentionality or subjectivity to someone, behavior prediction is all that we actually mean in the first place. All that we mean is that we expect this entity to behave in the way we do. That is, our language about human subjectivity is not actually language about an inner life. It really is just about predictable behavior. Or how can you refer to what you cannot see? Thus, Dennett, in a certain way, makes the Turing test into a definition of intelligence. And in any case, as many married persons will know, the attribution to one's spouse of the expectations one has for one's own behavior often results in a misprediction of their behavior. It matters to me that my wife gives herself to me, and that we share a life together that encompasses our interiority. But this would be impossible for a robot or an artificial neural network. And so, Pache Dennett, robots will never be persons in the most meaningful significance of that word. Very well then, what will we make ourselves become in a world of robotic caregivers and companions? And I see no reason why such a world will not eventually be ours. The character Lazarus Long in Robert Heinlein's novel Time Enough for Love quips, "Progress isn't made by early risers. It's made by lazy men trying to find easier ways to do something." We replace human activities by technology when those activities are hard. Current discussions surrounding smartphone and tablet use by children exist because handing a 5-year-old a tablet is more convenient than setting aside time to talk to that 5-year-old, especially when the baby is crying, a project is due, and one is trying to load the dishwasher all at the same time. How much easier would it be to give the bulk of child rearing, especially bedtime, over to robotic caregivers who will seem to provide everything that we would provide, but without our foibles? Robotic nanny will never explode at the children when they break something for the 18th time that day. But to make robots interchangeable with human beings could do something very dangerous to us. It could train us to become consumers of others. What I mean is this: we will always treat androids as tools because we will rightly see their behaviors as products for our consumption, rather than as expressions of a personal life with its own self-possession. But I fear that this will affect how we treat people in general. How? Consider robots' behavior. The robots among us will be manufactured, and the neural networks that drive them will be trained because they will sell.
And they will sell because they will do the things and act in the ways that consumers want a purchased assistant or companion to act. Recently, in Europe, a man married a sex robot. It doesn't walk, it barely talks, but it does simulate certain aspects of intercourse. The sex robots of tomorrow will be domestic companions, able to read and rock climb with you as well as join you in other vigorous activities. They won't be seen as sex toys, but as boyfriends and girlfriends and spouses who will push you to new heights. Heights that, of course, you will have selected from a list of options for self-improvement. But such companions will never deeply require us to expand our view of how a person might be, as real relationships and human friendships can. They won't vex us. They won't force us to reevaluate who we are, nor even to think beyond how we want them to make us think. You might buy an app that will turn your domestic companion into an expert piano teacher. You will never access a setting on that app that will transform your domestic companion robot into a bedridden invalid who requires your heroic self-gift even when you feel disinclined to give it. Yet, even though we will treat our never too challenging Android companions as consumer products, we will not instinctively differentiate between androids and humans if the simulacrum is well enough constructed. So Dennett is right in part. We will not be able to avoid feeling that these companions are persons. And so, acting as consumers of agents whom we can't but feel are persons, we will learn to be consumers of behavior in general, including the behavior of other actual human beings. What then, when other human beings do not conform to my expectations and desires? We won't see this as a glimpse of a wider array of humanity. We will not struggle toward a charitable response. Instead, we may come to think of these others as simply faulty human beings, viewing them with the same sort of idle dissatisfaction that we would a robot that didn't deliver the set of behaviors and reactions that we wanted to consume. There is an analogy here to pornography and the sexual revolution, which have to some extent already commodified physicality. Human beings, as David Schindler pointed out earlier today, are present to one another in bodily fashion. There is, he said, a burden to the presence of the other, because it presents that other person to me. It cannot be controlled, but only received. However, if much of daily social interaction is conformed to the commodification of behavior by our interactions with physically humanoid robots, then we shall be trained to ignore as presence the bodily presence, even as we take possession of the robot's physicality. And just as the behavior of other humans may become to us a sort of commodity that is deficient when it fails to meet our expectations, the physicality of Android consumables may cause all physical presence to become a commodity. In our interactions with actual humans, then what are we to do? If we are not to treat them as slaves, then we must learn defensively to consider the physicality of another as simply their private property. In order to maintain the difference between another embodied person and an embodied robotic entity that we own, we may have to learn to treat other humans' physicality as a thing to be held at a distance, as the inaccessible property of another, rather than a personal presence to be respected and received. In Isaac Asimov's book, The Robots of Dawn, widespread video communication has rendered nakedness of no consequence when one is engaged in remote viewing. But it has rendered unbearable true physical co-presence even when clad. In the future of robotic slaves, the commodification of the behavior and the training of us to see the body as an instrument of delivering that commodified behavior may render physical presence of another not unbearable, but something perhaps that we will have to ignore in our desperate effort to resist the commodification of that human being. Progress to this future has begun already. We are already being trained to be consumers of the world around us by mundane artificial intelligences like the shopping recommendations on Amazon. When we live in a world that doesn't adapt to suit our expectations, we are challenged. When we meet people whose responses are not customized, adapted, and tuned to us, then we grow. Character and our virtue advance by living in human community. But with artificial intelligence, it is otherwise. Amazon's suggestions are based on your browsing and your purchase history, as well as the browsing and purchase histories of others who have purchased things such as you have. But it is also based on the history of your activities on the internet, even beyond Amazon. Amazon's AI does not jostle you beyond the groove into which you have settled. Indeed, by its suggestions, it smooths and trains our behavior to fit into a groove that has been worn for us by others. Education into human community is a similar process. Every culture is. But market-driven artificial intelligence is a poor educator and a poorer community still. In the smart houses of the future, my whole world and my experience will obey the principle that my environment and my embodied companions will deliver what I expect, or what I am trained to expect, to pay for. Yet that is too narrow a frame of reference. In such a world of easy and confirmed expectations, I may forget that my view of myself and others is not the horizon of the possible or of the good. And so, having started out seeking to develop an artificial intelligence that could rise to human levels, the risk is that as AI rises in its abilities, human subjectivity, increasingly integrated with these AI systems, will begin to be flattened, diluted to the level of what these systems are capable of representing, or of what is rewarded in them by consumers. The word artifice means handiwork, work of skill. Artificial intelligence is indeed a wondrous work. And yet, if we allow that artifice to become our reality, to form our lives and our children, then we will become artifices ourselves, handiwork of our handiworks. Thank you.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed our pilot episode. I know it was kind of long. I don't necessarily intend for all the episodes to be that long, but this was a nonfiction one, and it was literally just pretty much straight the audio from this event. Future episodes should not be nearly as long. If you liked it, please subscribe to us and consider listening to some of our other content. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.